Imagine waking up tomorrow morning, you stop at a fuel station, and the price of petrol has jumped overnight. Airline tickets become more expensive. The cost of transporting food begins to rise. Factories start paying more for energy. Stock markets become volatile. Inflation returns. And governments around the world begin holding emergency meetings. What caused all of this? Not a world war. Not a global pandemic, not a financial crisis, but a narrow stretch of water, barely 33 kilometers wide at its narrowest point. A place that most people have never visited. A place that many have never even heard of. The Strait of Hormuz. Every time tensions rise in this small waterway, the entire world pays attention. Oil traders monitor it around the clock. Shipping companies reroute their vessels. Governments prepare contingency plans. Financial markets react within minutes because everyone understands one simple fact. If the Strait of Hormuz is disrupted, the consequences won't remain in the Middle East. They will spread across the globe. But why? How can one narrow waterway influence the daily lives of billions of people? The answer lies in something that powers almost every modern economy: energy. Although the world is gradually investing in renewable energy, oil and natural gas remain the backbone of global transportation, manufacturing, aviation, shipping, and heavy industry. Every airplane that crosses an ocean, every cargo ship carrying goods between continents, every truck delivering food to supermarkets, every factory producing steel, chemicals, or electronics depends, directly or indirectly, on reliable energy supplies, and a significant share of that energy travels through one single maritime corridor, the Strait of Hormuz. This isn't simply a regional shipping lane. It is one of the world's most important strategic choke points. Every day, enormous volumes of crude oil and liquefied natural gas leave the Persian Gulf through this passage before reaching customers across Asia, Europe, and other parts of the world. Countries like Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Kuwait, Qatar, the United Arab Emirates, and Iran all depend heavily on this route to export their energy resources. For many importing nations, including India, China, Japan, and South Korea, the uninterrupted flow of energy through Hormuz remains critically important. That's why even a rumor of military escalation can send shockwaves through international markets. Sometimes, tankers continue sailing safely. Nothing actually happens, yet oil prices still rise. Why? Because markets don't only react to events, they react to uncertainty. The possibility of disruption is often enough to increase insurance costs, raise freight charges, and push energy prices higher. And once oil becomes more expensive, almost everything else follows. Transportation costs rise, manufacturing becomes more expensive, import goods cost more, inflation increases, central banks face difficult decisions, economic growth slows. Suddenly, a crisis thousands of kilometers away begins affecting families, businesses, and governments across continents. This is why the Strait of Hormuz is far more than a geographic location. It is an economic pressure point for the entire world. But there is another reason this narrow waterway attracts so much global attention. It isn't controlled by one country alone. It lies between Iran and Oman, in one of the world's most politically sensitive regions. For decades, the strait has been surrounded by military competition, diplomatic tensions, naval patrols, and strategic rivalries involving regional powers and global superpowers alike. Whenever these tensions increase, the world begins asking the same question. What happens if the Strait of Hormuz is blocked? Would oil stop flowing? Would global trade collapse? Would fuel prices double? Could the world economy fall into recession? These aren't hypothetical questions. They are questions governments, energy companies, military planners, and investors prepare for every single year, because history has repeatedly shown that this small stretch of water possesses extraordinary geopolitical importance. And yet, despite its enormous influence over the global economy, most people know remarkably little about it. So in this documentary, we're going to explore how one narrow waterway became one of the most valuable strategic locations on Earth. We'll uncover why the world's largest economies depend on it, why America maintains a constant military presence nearby, why Iran considers it one of its greatest strategic advantages, and why every major conflict in the Persian Gulf immediately sends shockwaves through global energy markets. Because once you understand the Strait of Hormuz, you'll understand why the price of oil, the stability of the global economy, and the balance of international power are far more connected than they first appear. But before we discuss oil tankers, military fleets, and global markets, we first need to answer a much simpler question. What exactly is the Strait of Hormuz? And why is this tiny waterway so important that the entire world depends on it? If someone asked you to point to the most important place in the global economy, you might think of Wall Street, or perhaps the port of Shanghai, maybe Silicon Valley. But one of the world's most important economic locations isn't a financial center or a technology hub. It's a narrow stretch of water between Iran to the north and Oman to the south, the Strait of Hormuz. At first glance, it doesn't look extraordinary. On a world map, it's just a thin blue line connecting the Persian Gulf to the Gulf of Oman, and from there to the Arabian Sea and the Indian Ocean. But appearances can be deceiving, because this tiny waterway serves as the only major maritime gateway for some of the world's largest oil and natural gas exporters. Every day, giant oil tankers, some longer than 3 football fields, slowly pass through this narrow corridor, carrying millions of barrels of crude oil toward customers around the world. Imagine a highway with only one exit. Every truck carrying food, medicine, fuel, and essential goods must pass through that single road. If traffic stops, everything behind it comes to a halt. The Strait of Hormuz functions in much the same way. It is the main exit for the Persian Gulf. Without it, exporting energy from the region becomes dramatically more difficult. Hanguangro, the energy highway around the Persian Gulf, sits some of the world's richest energy-producing nations: Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Kuwait, the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, and Iran. Together, these countries produce an enormous share of the world's crude oil and natural gas. But producing energy is only half the story. The real challenge is delivering it to customers thousands of kilometers away. Europe, India, China, Japan, South Korea. Almost every major Asian economy depends heavily on imported energy. And for many shipments, the journey begins in the Strait of Hormuz. Every single day, hundreds of commercial vessels move through these waters. Oil tankers, LNG, carriers, dot-clan ships, support vessels. Each one forms part of a global supply chain that most people rarely think about. Yet without these ships, modern economies would struggle to function. Homegrounders, why can't ships just use another route? This seems like an obvious question. If Hormuz is so vulnerable, why not simply choose another path? The answer lies in geography. Unlike ordinary roads, oceans cannot always be bypassed. Most Gulf countries have coastlines inside the Persian Gulf. To reach the open ocean, ships must first pass through the Strait of Hormuz. Some countries have built pipelines that transport limited amounts of oil to ports outside the Gulf. These pipelines provide useful alternatives during emergencies, but they cannot replace the enormous volume carried daily by tankers through Hormuz. Think of them as side roads, helpful but far too small to replace the main highway. That's why shipping companies, governments, and energy markets continue watching Hormuz so closely. Why? Every trader watches. Hormuz, here's something interesting. Oil prices don't only change when supply changes. They also change when people believe supply might change. Imagine hearing that a major airport may close tomorrow because of severe weather. Even before flights are canceled, airlines begin adjusting schedules. Passengers change their plans, hotels receive cancellations. The expectation itself creates economic effects. The same thing happens in oil markets. If investors believe the Strait of Hormuz could face disruptions, they begin preparing immediately. Oil futures rise. Insurance companies increase premiums for tankers. Shipping firms calculate new risks. Governments review emergency fuel reserves. Sometimes nothing actually happens. The ships continue sailing, yet prices have already moved. Because uncertainty itself has value, Markets dislike uncertainty more than almost anything else. Hunter-gatherers, the world's most expensive shortcut, the Strait of Hormuz, is often called a maritime choke point. A choke point is a narrow passage where large amounts of trade must pass through a small area. History is filled with such places: the Panama Canal, the Suez Canal, the Strait of Malacca. But few are as closely connected to global energy as Hormuz. Every additional day of disruption can cost billions of dollars through higher transportation costs, delayed shipments, and rising energy prices. This explains why even countries located thousands of kilometers away care deeply about what happens here. Japan watches Hormuz, China watches Hormuz, India watches Hormuz. European governments watch Hormuz. Even countries importing little oil directly from the Gulf still monitor events closely because higher global oil prices affect everyone. When transportation becomes more expensive, food becomes more expensive, manufacturing becomes more expensive, electricity becomes more expensive in many regions. Inflation spreads across the economy. The strait may be located in the Middle East, but its influence reaches nearly every continent. Hongrolus, underus, more than just oil, many people believe. Hormuz is only important because of crude oil. That's only part of the picture. The strait also plays a major role in transporting liquefied natural gas, or LNG. Countries like Qatar export enormous quantities of LNG to customers around the world. Natural gas powers industries, generates electricity, heats homes, supports chemical manufacturing, and increasingly serves as a bridge fuel during the global energy transition. A disruption in LNG shipments can affect electricity prices and industrial production far beyond the Middle East. So Hormuz isn't just an oil route, it's an energy corridor. One of the most important on Earth. Bungo Dago. Geography became power history, often teaches us that geography shapes politics. Some countries possess mountains that protect them. Others control rivers that support trade. Iran possesses something different: a coastline overlooking one of the world's most strategically valuable waterways. That geography has given the Strait of Hormuz extraordinary geopolitical importance. It explains why major naval powers operate nearby, why military planners constantly study the region, why diplomats work to reduce tensions, and why investors around the world pay attention whenever headlines mention this narrow passage. Because whoever influences the security of Hormuz can influence far more than regional politics. They can influence the rhythm of the global economy itself. But if this tiny waterway is so important, who actually protects it? Who has the power to keep ships moving safely? And why has the United States maintained one of its largest naval presences here for decades? That's where our story takes a dramatic turn. In the next chapter, we'll explore why the Strait of Hormuz isn't just an economic lifeline. It's also one of the world's most heavily guarded geopolitical flashpoints. By now, we've seen why the Strait of Hormuz is so important to the global economy. Millions of barrels of oil, massive LNG shipments, and some of the world's busiest energy trade routes all pass through this narrow stretch of water. But this raises another question. If the Strait of Hormuz is so valuable, who protects it? The answer isn't as simple as one country or one navy. Instead, the strait has become one of the most militarized waterways on Earth. Every day, commercial tankers travel through these waters. At the same time, warships patrol nearby, surveillance aircraft monitor the skies, satellites observe every major movement, and intelligence agencies closely watch every development. Because everyone understands one thing: if shipping stops here, the consequences will be felt around the world. America's long presence for decades, the United States has maintained a strong naval presence in the Persian Gulf. Unlike an army defending a border, a navy protects something much larger: freedom of navigation. The principle is simple. Commercial ships carrying legal cargo should be able to move safely through international waterways without intimidation or disruption. For a country like the United States, whose economy is deeply connected to global trade, protecting sea lanes has long been a strategic priority. This is why American naval forces regularly operate in and around the Persian Gulf. Their mission isn't only about defending American interests, it also involves supporting the security of international shipping routes used by countries from every continent. Because when an oil tanker leaves Saudi Arabia, its cargo may be heading to India, China, Japan, South Korea, or Europe. The energy flowing through Hormuz belongs to a global marketplace, not just one nation. Iran's greatest strategic advantage. Now let's look at the strait from a different perspective. Imagine you're Iran. You may not have the world's largest economy or the world's largest navy, but you possess something many countries don't: geography. Iran stretches along the northern coastline of the Strait of Hormuz. That location gives Tehran significant strategic influence over one of the world's most important maritime corridors. This doesn't mean Iran controls the strait. International shipping continues under international maritime law, but Iran's geographic position ensures that any regional tension immediately captures global attention. Military planners around the world recognize this reality. Even without matching the military capabilities of larger powers, geography itself provides Iran with strategic leverage. It's one of the clearest examples of how location can become a source of national power. Horned growlers, the silent battle at sea. Most people imagine modern conflicts as large battles involving tanks and fighter jets. But maritime security often looks very different. Instead of dramatic invasions, tensions may involve commercial shipping, naval patrols, escort missions, surveillance operations, electronic monitoring, intelligence gathering, and diplomatic communication designed to prevent misunderstandings. Much of this happens quietly, far from television cameras. Yet these daily operations help maintain confidence among shipping companies and global markets, because stability at sea often prevents much larger crises on land. Regardless, every tanker carries more than oil. Imagine an oil tanker leaving the Persian Gulf. To most people, it's simply another ship. But economists see something very different. That vessel represents fuel for airlines, electricity generation, factories, public transportation, agriculture, manufacturing, global trade. If that shipment arrives safely, millions of businesses continue operating normally. If it's delayed, costs begin increasing throughout the supply chain. One ship may appear insignificant. Thousands of ships together keep the modern economy moving. That's why protecting shipping routes is about much more than maritime security. It's about protecting economic stability itself. $100. Why markets react so quickly? Here's something fascinating. Oil markets respond far faster than physical supply chains. The moment investors believe tensions are increasing, prices begin moving. Not because oil has disappeared, but because markets price future risk. Shipping companies may pay higher insurance premiums. Pumpers begin purchasing additional supplies. Governments review emergency reserves. Financial institutions reassess energy markets. Within minutes, billions of dollars can move through global financial systems, all because uncertainty has increased around one narrow waterway. This explains why headlines mentioning Hormuz often appear alongside reports about rising oil prices. Sometimes the physical flow of oil hasn't changed at all. Only expectations have. Yet expectations themselves influence economic behavior. More than America. And Iran, many people describe Hormuz as a confrontation between America and Iran. But reality is much more complicated. The strait matters to nearly every major economy. China depends heavily on energy imports passing through these waters. India receives significant supplies from Gulf producers. Japan and South Korea closely monitor every development. European economies also watch events carefully because global oil prices affect their industries and consumers. In other words, Hormuz isn't important because two countries disagree. It's important because the global economy depends on uninterrupted maritime trade. That is why governments often encourage restraint whenever tensions rise. No major economy benefits from prolonged disruption. Everyone has something to lose. The balance that keeps the world moving every day, something remarkable happens. Oil tankers continue sailing, commercial ships continue trading, energy continues flowing. Most people never think about it because when global trade works well, it becomes invisible. Only when that system is threatened do we realize how carefully it has been maintained. The Strait of Hormuz is one of the clearest examples of this invisible balance, a place where diplomacy, military deterrence, international trade, and economic stability all meet. For decades, that balance has allowed the global economy to function. But what if one day that balance breaks? What if ships can no longer move safely through the strait? Could the world's largest oil exporters find another route? Would crude oil prices double? Could inflation return across the world? Or would governments find ways to avoid a global energy crisis? In the next chapter, we'll explore the question that economists, investors, and world leaders fear the most. What would actually happen if the Strait of Hormuz were closed? And how quickly could the global economy feel the impact? For decades, one question has worried governments, economists, military planners, and energy companies alike. What happens if the Strait of Hormuz is closed? At first, the answer seems obvious. Oil shipments stop, prices rise, problem solved. But reality is far more complicated because closing the Strait of Hormuz wouldn't simply create an oil shortage. It would trigger a chain reaction across the global economy, one event leading to another and another, until almost every country feels the consequences. Let's see how that chain reaction unfolds. Day 1. The markets panic. Imagine waking up to breaking news. Several major shipping companies have announced that they are temporarily suspending tanker operations through the Strait of Hormuz due to escalating security concerns. No oil has actually disappeared yet. The storage facilities are still full, refineries are still operating, fuel stations are still open. Yet within minutes, financial markets begin reacting. Crude oil prices jump sharply, energy company stocks rise, airline shares fall, shipping companies begin reassessing routes. Insurance firms immediately increase premiums for vessels entering the Persian Gulf. Because markets don't wait for disaster, they price in the possibility of disaster. Uncertainty itself becomes expensive. Week 1. The cost of transportation rises as days pass, the effects become visible. Every oil tanker now faces higher insurance costs. Some shipping companies delay departures. Others reroute vessels where possible. Transporting energy becomes slower and far more expensive. Those additional costs don't disappear. They are passed along to buyers. Oil importing countries now pay more for every shipment they receive. Refineries purchase more expensive crude oil. Fuel distributors pay higher transportation costs. Petrol stations eventually raise prices. The increase reaches ordinary consumers, not because fuel suddenly became scarce, but because moving it became far more expensive. Month 1. Inflation returns. Now imagine this situation continues for several weeks. Oil doesn't only fuel cars, it powers trucks, ships, aircraft, factories, construction equipment, agriculture, mining, and countless industrial processes. When energy becomes expensive, almost everything becomes expensive. A farmer pays more for diesel. A factory pays more for electricity. A shipping company raises freight charges. A supermarket pays more for deliveries. Eventually, consumers pay more for food, electronics, clothing, building materials. Almost every product becomes slightly more expensive. Economists call this cost push inflation. One increase in energy prices spreads throughout the economy like falling dominoes. Hot and glow are the countries that feel it first. Not every nation experiences the crisis in the same way. Countries heavily dependent on imported energy often feel the impact first. India, Japan, South Korea, many European countries, China, these economies consume enormous amounts of oil every day. If prices remain elevated, manufacturing becomes more expensive. Transportation costs increase. Economic growth begins slowing. Governments may be forced to spend billions supporting fuel supplies or protecting consumers from rising prices. Even countries producing their own energy are not completely protected. Oil is traded globally. If international prices rise, domestic markets often experience pressure as well. No major economy exists in isolation anymore. Airlines, shipping, and everyday life now think beyond fuel stations. Every commercial airline depends on jet fuel. Every cargo ship depends on marine fuel. Every delivery company relies on trucks. When fuel prices increase, airline tickets become more expensive. International shipping costs rise. Import products become costlier. Online shopping prices increase. Holiday travel becomes more expensive. Businesses delay investments. Consumers reduce spending. What began as a maritime security problem slowly becomes an economic problem affecting everyday life. This is why investors around the world pay close attention whenever tensions rise near Hormuz. They understand that today's shipping disruption can become tomorrow's inflation report. Can other routes replace Hormuz? Many people assume there's a simple solution. Just send the oil another way. Unfortunately, geography isn't that flexible. Several Gulf countries have invested in pipelines leading to ports outside the Persian Gulf. These systems provide valuable alternatives during emergencies, but together they cannot replace the enormous volume transported daily through the Strait of Hormuz. Imagine closing an 8-lane highway and asking everyone to use 2 small country roads instead. Traffic continues moving, but much more slowly. The same principle applies here. Alternative pipelines reduce risk. They don't eliminate dependence. Hormuz remains the fastest, cheapest, and most efficient route for much of the region's energy exports. Gremlers. Why governments prepare years in advance? Because the consequences could be so severe. Governments don't wait for a crisis before making plans. Many countries maintain strategic petroleum reserves. These are enormous underground storage facilities containing emergency supplies of crude oil. Their purpose isn't to replace global production forever. They're designed to buy time. Time for diplomacy, time for shipping routes to reopen, time for markets to stabilize. At the same time, navies conduct exercises, energy companies diversify supply chains, importing nations seek additional suppliers. All of these preparations exist because policymakers understand one uncomfortable truth: preventing a Hormuz crisis is far easier than managing one. Hormuz, the world's most expensive choke point by now, one thing becomes clear: the Strait of Hormuz is much more than a narrow waterway. It is one of the world's greatest economic pressure points. Its importance doesn't come from its size, it comes from what passes through it every single day. Energy, trade, confidence, global stability. If those flows continue, the world barely notices. If they stop, everyone notices. That is why governments monitor the strait around the clock. That is why investors react to every headline. And that is why military planners from multiple countries consider Hormuz one of the most strategically important locations on Earth. But here's the biggest surprise. Despite all this attention, the world is already trying to reduce its dependence on Hormuz. New pipelines are being built. Renewable energy is expanding. Electric vehicles are becoming more common. Countries are searching for new energy sources and new trade routes. So the final question is no longer whether Hormuz is important today. The real question is, will the Strait of Hormuz still control the global economy 20 or 30 years from now? In our final chapter, we'll explore whether the world can ever escape its dependence on this tiny waterway, or whether geography will continue to shape the global economy for generations to come. For decades, the global economy has depended on one narrow waterway. But today, governments around the world are asking a different question. What if we didn't have to? What if the world could reduce its dependence on the Strait of Hormuz? Would oil prices become more stable? Would global trade become safer? Would geopolitical tensions lose their economic power? At first, the answer seems simple. Build new pipelines that tie new shipping routes. Switch to renewable energy. Problem solved, but once again, reality is much more complicated. Hongrambolaos, the search for alternative routes. Imagine you're the leader of an oil-producing country. Every year, billions of dollars worth of crude oil leave your ports, but almost all of it must pass through one narrow choke point. Wouldn't you want another option? That's exactly what several Gulf countries have been trying to build. Over the last 2 decades, governments have invested billions of dollars in pipelines that bypass parts of the Persian Gulf. Some oil can now reach ports on the Red Sea. Some can be exported through terminals on the Gulf of Oman. These projects provide valuable flexibility during periods of tension, but there's one major limitation: capacity. A pipeline can transport only a certain amount of oil each day. Modern supertankers, on the other hand, move enormous volumes across oceans at relatively low cost. Even with new infrastructure, most Gulf exports still rely on maritime shipping. The Strait of Hormuz remains the fastest and most economical route. Can renewable energy solve the problem? Many people believe the energy transition will eventually make Hormuz irrelevant. After all, electric vehicles are becoming more common. Solar farms are expanding. Wind power continues growing. Countries are investing heavily in hydrogen, batteries, and cleaner technologies. So doesn't that mean oil will soon become unimportant? Not quite. Oil isn't used only to produce fuel for cars. It plays a major role in aviation, shipping, petrochemicals, plastics, fertilizers, pharmaceutical products, industrial manufacturing. Even as electricity becomes cleaner, global demand for oil remains substantial, especially in developing economies where energy consumption continues increasing. The transition is happening, but it is gradual. For the foreseeable future, oil will remain one of the foundations of the global economy. And as long as Gulf producers remain among the world's largest exporters, Hormuz will remain strategically important. The new race for energy security. One lesson from recent geopolitical crises has become very clear. Countries no longer want to depend on a single supplier or a single route. Around the world, governments are trying to diversify their energy sources. Europe has sought additional suppliers beyond traditional markets. Asian economies are expanding strategic petroleum reserves. Countries are investing in nuclear power, natural gas infrastructure, renewable energy, and domestic production wherever possible. This isn't about abandoning Middle Eastern energy. It's about reducing vulnerability, because diversification creates resilience. The more options a country has, the better it can respond during future crises. Technology is changing the equation. Another major change is technology. Artificial intelligence now helps shipping companies optimize routes. Satellites monitor tanker movements in real time. Drones improve maritime surveillance. Advanced forecasting allows governments to prepare for supply disruptions more quickly than ever before. Financial markets also react faster than at any point in history. Within seconds of major geopolitical news, oil prices, shipping companies, energy stocks, and currencies begin moving. Technology hasn't removed uncertainty, but it has transformed how the world responds to it. Why geography still wins despite all these advances? There is one thing technology cannot change: geography. You cannot move continents, you cannot relocate oceans, and you cannot create another Strait of Hormuz. History repeatedly reminds us that geography shapes global politics. The Suez Canal transformed international trade. The Panama Canal connected 2 oceans. The Strait of Malacca became essential for Asian commerce, and the Strait of Hormuz became the world's most important energy gateway. Technology changes, governments change, markets change, but geography often remains constant. That is why some places continue shaping world events century after century. Honegrilus. The future of the global economy. Will the Strait of Hormuz still matter in 50 years? Perhaps not in exactly the same way. The global energy mix will continue evolving. Electric transportation will expand. Alternative fuels will become more common. New pipelines may reduce dependence. But complete independence is unlikely to happen quickly, because global energy systems evolve over decades, not years. Until that transition is complete, Hormuz will remain one of the world's most closely watched waterways. Every major economy understands this. Every energy company understands this. Every military planner understands this. Hongralgaraz, a tiny waterway with global power. Think about what we've learned. The Strait of Hormuz occupies only a tiny space on the map, yet it influences oil prices, inflation, shipping costs, financial markets, military strategy, diplomacy, and international trade. Very few places on Earth possess that level of influence. It proves something remarkable. Power doesn't always come from size. Sometimes, power comes from location. A narrow strip of water between two coastlines has become one of the most valuable pieces of geography in modern history, and that explains why the world continues watching it so carefully. Transition to the final chapter. So, after everything we've explored, one question remains. Is the Strait of Hormuz merely an oil route, or has it become something even greater? A symbol of how geography, economics, and geopolitics are inseparably connected. In the final chapter, we'll bring everything together and answer the biggest question of all. Why does one tiny waterway continue to shape the future of the global economy? And what does that mean for the decades ahead?